when women feel like they're part of that effort to protect the forest, and protect it from sort of unsustainable use, if they're more involved, it's more likely to be successful.
So we're going to move on to UNDP. So what is UNDP's approach and support on gender mainstreaming in Indonesia?
So our approach is very much driven by our gender equality strategy. This has a number of components, which is really about ensuring that gender considerations are mainstreamed or integrated into the various areas of work that we do. And that's both in the thematic areas that we work in, so whether it's climate change, disaster risk reduction, governance, sustainable finance, etc. But it's also how do we integrate that into the way we work, so our operational aspects. So of course, being in Indonesia, it means we're also very much aligned to the government of Indonesia's priorities on gender equality and women's empowerment. So for instance, we know that the next mid-year, the 5-year plan and the longer term plan have strong considerations. So we focus quite a bit on shifting economic power relations between men and women, and how do you equip women to have the necessary skills and capacities to contribute meaningfully. We also ensure or enable ways in which women can be part of decision making. So training women to be forest rangers, for instance, which is maybe not an area that is traditionally associated with women, but we think that has a huge importance. As I'm sure you know, there's a lot of discussion around the energy transition right now in Indonesia. I think recent studies showed that only about 5% of decision makers in energy companies are women. 5%, right? So that's definitely an area that we hope there will be further change in. But the energy the transition towards more sustainable and renewable energy also creates opportunities. And we want to make sure women are both contributing to that. They are being targeted with the right kind of skills and capacities that they can absorb to contribute meaningfully to that transition, and then fully benefit from it as well. Another example is access to finance. So we work a lot with small and medium and small enterprises, and so interestingly enough, there are actually many women in that sector. Why? Because it's fairly informal, right? Which means some of the legal battles that women may have to face to formalize those can be pushed aside because it's still informal. But they're huge contributors. The MSMEs are huge contributors to the economy. So we've also had a number of initiatives that have targeted women-led enterprises and women entrepreneurs to be able to have the skills to develop better business proposals, to be able to access small loans from financial institutions. And that's the way in which you are basically not limiting yourself to a project cycle, but by equipping men and women with those types of skills means that they can pursue that way beyond the end of a project cycle, for instance. But equally, we also put a lot of emphasis around our operations. So to give you an example, we are what we call a gold seal office. So UNDP has this certification whereby UNDP offices that have been able to prove that they're taking the necessary actions to embed gender equality and women's rights in the way we conduct our businesses, in addition to our programs, are awarded this gold seal. And there's a number of criteria that have to be met, right? And so we're a gold seal office, and we were the first one in the Asia Pacific region within UN. Thank you. Yeah, we're very proud of that. And of course, the challenge is to keep renewing it. It's valid for 5 years. But that also is a testament to how we've been trying to integrate gender considerations in our operations as well. And likewise on human resources. So in our office at the moment, we are actually very good. We're between 45 to 55% of men-women ratio at different levels. Whereas in the professional levels and positions, we have slightly more men than women. So we want to change that. So when we recruit for professional positions, there will be considerations for women, strong women applicants. Likewise, in the general services category, we will pay attention to ensure that men are also not underrepresented in that. And that's how you kind of address some of these systemic changes that we see. So yeah, these are some of the ways we walk the talk, if you will. It is a guiding principle, and luckily we have the means to put in practice, what we believe in. Yeah,
that's great. Going back to some of your programs, are there any examples that you can show, like of the impact of some of this intervention or some of the programs or initiatives?
Sure. So as I mentioned, with one of our combating wildlife trade project, this has included training, as I mentioned, of women to become forest rangers. And what we know is, and this is not to say men don't, but we also know that when women feel like they're part of that effort to protect the forest, and protect it from sort of unsustainable use, if they're more involved, it's more likely to be successful. Another maybe a policy level sort of work that we've done, I'm going to refer to one maybe more in the past. During the Reformasi period, when UNDP was supporting and working with the government of Indonesia on political participation, etc., there were a number of initiatives that were aimed at encouraging more political parties to have more women representation, at least in the candidates that were being put forward, right? And over the years, whereas I think the rate of women parliamentarians at that time in the early 2000s was anywhere from 5 to 10%, we're now at around 21%, right? Now, it's not just UNDP, of course not. I think any kind of development result that we talk about can be attributed to many different partners. However, that's the kind of link that are always very encouraging to see, that some initiatives actually led to legislative changes that made it a requirement to have 30% of women being candidates in legislative elections, for instance. More recently, on climate change. So we have been working very closely with the Ministry of Finance on looking at the way in which Indonesia's public budget is climate aligned, or what percentage of Indonesia's allocation and expenditures can be called climate friendly. So we did that through this process called climate budget tagging. Now, we know that climate change impacts men and women differently, right? So there has been efforts to also look at, from that budget that can be tagged or identified as climate relevant, what of that is also specifically addressing gender dimensions. So I think these are different levels of interventions that are examples of how and what we do.
How impactful it is. Is there a way, or how do you measure success or effectiveness when it comes to kind of gender mainstreaming?
Yeah, that's always a very difficult question in development in general, and I think there's different layers to that. First of all, we have projects and initiatives, right? And projects have monitoring and evaluation frameworks, for instance. So we have indicators that we set. Luckily, we've evolved from just looking at number of women's participation to say, how many sort of action points that were decided at a meeting were actually addressing gender or women's needs or women's priorities. So there's different types of indicators you can have at a project level. But I think the most, the changes that are likely to enable the kind of transformative change that we want, the systemic changes that we want, is really when we ask ourselves questions of sustainability and policy level impact. For a couple of reasons. Projects have limited time spans, right? And so while we may have a very good number of women who've benefited from a project effort, that's great. What happens after that, right? But if we've actually put in place mechanisms where, let's say, local financial institutions, and I want to give you, maybe repeat an example I mentioned earlier around working with MSMEs. We've opened the door for a financial institution to provide loans at minimal interest rate for entrepreneurs, women-led entrepreneurs, right? Enterprises, sorry. So that's not going to stop within that project cycle. That financial institution is committed to sort of continuing those efforts because they've seen that it works through this project that we've done. So they've been able to assess the kind of risks that is associated. And B, women are actually, there's also research that shows that they're less likely to default on their loans, right? So that longer term continuation of these efforts, I think, is a sign of success. And we need to be able to measure that, so our M&E frameworks also have to be quite temporal, right? So it cannot be just limited to a project lifestyle. We kind of regularly have to check in on progress being made. And then the other would really be at the policy level, because as I mentioned, with the legislative, women's representation in legislative elections, I think is an important example of how certain actions actually led to a policy change. And unless there's someone who decides that policy is no longer relevant, it is actually here to stay, and it means it can only continue to, it will be adhered to. We have a reference point to go back to, and hopefully we go from 30% to 50%. So there's always room for further progress. But I think those are the kind of meaningful, long-lasting changes that we want to see. When it comes to sort of measuring our impact and effectiveness.
Right. Okay, so I want to talk about gender stories. UNDP used gender stories to explore kind of various dimensions of gender experiences. Can you tell me how this works, why this is important? And maybe while we're doing that also, what do you see as the role of social media platform to kind of increase awareness and mainstream even this gender perspective to a wider audience?
Stories are very important. I think, the narratives that we have about our work, we do a lot of interesting work. We don't communicate them enough, perhaps, right? And so over the last couple of years, we've really put an emphasis on telling our story. Our story is the Indonesian story, right? It's not UNDP's story per se. It's just what we've managed to facilitate or support and work very closely with our Indonesian partners, government, civil society, academia, etc. So the stories are important to go beyond what, let's say, project reports might do. Project reports are requirements, but they don't necessarily talk about the human element. And for us, we are the United Nations Development Program. Our focus is on, one of our flagship reports is the Human Development Report, which puts people really at the center of everything we do. And stories enable us to give that human face to the kind of sometimes very, very technical work that we do. So stories make it maybe more accessible for a general public to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and most importantly, is it making a difference? So, and the stories are not necessarily gender stories. There are stories about what we do on climate, there are stories about what we do on sustainable finance, on health, but they all have a very strong gender element because we talk about specific challenges that women faced or face and how the initiatives is helping to overcome them and what more can be done, of course. So for me, storytelling and doing so effectively is very important to also access the diverse group of people, right? I mean, Indonesia is vast. So we need to be able to resonate with the people we're meant to serve. So stories are a good way of doing that. Now, to address your second question on social media, I think we can't afford not to use social media. And I think it's in an archipelagic country such as Indonesia, right, with so many islands, many of them are so remote, and you still have communities, etc. Social media enables access to these stories in a way that traditional media would not. I think the radio is probably an exception. The difference with social media is now the people who are receiving the information can also engage. Right? So then it becomes a two-way communication. And I think that's the beauty of it. So social media, you need content, and that's where our stories come in, that's where our work comes in. But social media is the means in which you communicate that faster to a wider range of people, and you're also able to get feedback. So I think that's the beauty of it, and it's something that very advantageous for us to really spread our message far and wide. So we're using all different types of medium available to us as well to convey our message.
Okay, thank you.